Welcome to my guide for the Lore of Heavens. In this guide I will go over every single spell in the lore and tell you how to best use them to make sure you're getting the most out of them in your battles. The Lore of Heavens is one of the more offensive lores in the game, with 4 out of the 6 spells causing damage directly to enemies and only 1 being used to buff your own units. This combined with the long cast range on most spells makes it a real terror and a must pick for every faction that can get their hands on it. The lore can be used by Bretonnia, the Empire, High Elves and Lizardmen. Now let's get into the spells. Roiling Skies is the passive of the lore, and as usual its effect is felt map-wide. It targets enemy flying units and causes them to suffer minus 24% speed and minus 20 melee defense for 25 seconds. This can be very useful for keeping some enemies in sight of your ranged units to allow them to get more shots off. Of course, since it's a passive, it's only activated upon casting another spell with the Heavens caster, and it has no upgrade or overcast options. As passives go, it's not too bad, but it is very situational, since if the enemy has no flying units, it will do nothing. But at the end of the day, it's not going to win or lose your battles. Harmonic Convergence is our first castable spell, and it's an augment. It costs 6 winds of magic, has a 30-second cooldown, and a 200-meter range. It grants allies or the caster plus 24 melee attack and defense for 22 seconds, so is great for boosting some of your high damage units into the stratosphere, or for giving something weaker a little help versus superior units. It can be overcast to also give the unit plus 30 armor at the cost of 10 winds of magic and the standard 50% miscast chance. You know what, from here on out I'm just going to say overcasting brings a base risk of 50% miscast chance unless stated otherwise. Anyway, the overcasted version is great for when you really want to toughen up your units that little bit extra, but since armor can be bypassed by armor piercing damage, it's not really worth overcasting in my opinion. The base spell, however, is great for helping your units both take less and deal more damage, so is always a great choice for using in battle. Wind Blast is next up, and it's a breath spell. It only costs 8 winds of magic and has a 32-second cooldown and a 100-meter cast range. It can only be cast on the ground and causes moderate magical damage in an expanding tear shape that lasts 6 seconds. It's important to remember that since this isn't a direct damage spell, the damage has no allegiance, so once it's going, it can just as easily damage your units if you aim it incorrectly. It's best used versus multiple units, but isn't the best at getting through armor, so is generally reserved for mopping up chaff. It can be overcast to deal increased AP damage at the cost of 11 winds of magic, but this still doesn't make it amazing at dealing with tougher units, especially when you look at the other options you have in the lore for dealing with them. I'd say the base version of the spell is a good pick if your opponent has a lot of less armoured units in a large clump, but as far as overcasting is concerned, it doesn't really get used too much in my experience. Yeren's Thunderbolt is third, and this time it's a bombardment. It costs 6 winds of magic, has a 42-second cooldown, and a cast range of 300 meters. It can only be cast on the ground, and deals major magical damage in a small strike area. It is effective in the middle of a heavily armoured unit, and is also pretty decent at destroying artillery pieces, meaning even if the team returns, they won't be able to fire. It lasts 4 seconds and can do some pretty serious damage if it hits the target's centre mass. Overcasting causes the AP damage of the impact and explosion to be increased at the cost of 10 winds of magic, so it's very useful when you're going against the toughest infantry. For most units, the base spell should work just fine, but if you're going against something stupidly tough, then the overcast isn't a bad option and isn't too expensive. Curse of the Midnight Wind is next up, and it's a hex. It costs 11 winds of magic, has a 38-second cooldown, and a 200-meter cast range. It can be cast on the ground or on enemies directly, and it causes enemy units within its 40-meter AoE to get minus 30 armor and minus 24 melee attack for 25 seconds. This is a great spell for using on the enemy front lines when your melee troops are outclassed and need every advantage they can get. Not only will the enemies be more vulnerable to all forms of damage from the lack of armor, they will also be less effective on the offense with the huge debuff to their chance to even connect a hit. Overcasting doubles the duration to 50 seconds at the cost of 17 winds of magic, and obviously is only really worth using if you feel the enemy will stick around beyond the first 25 seconds of debuffs. Both versions of the spell are equally as useful, so it's really down to your judgment whether or not you need the overcast. The Comet of Cassandra is our next spell, and it's another bombardment. It costs 13 winds of magic, has a 49-second cooldown, and a 200-meter cast range. It can only be cast on the ground and causes massive magical damage in a large strike area along with a huge explosion. It is very strong versus clumps of elite enemy infantry and has no problem getting through some of the toughest armour. It's worth bearing in mind that it takes 7 seconds for the comet to complete its explosion, so a little bit of timing needs to be used if you're trying to hit a moving target. The overcast version of the spell increases the AP explosion damage at the cost of 20 winds of magic. The base version of the spell is great for any clumps in the enemy lines, and the overcast version is good for anything that needs a bit more of a punch to feel the damage, but either can really be used as many times you can afford in battle, and you'll be sure to pick up a massive number of kills. Finally, we come to Chain Lightning, and it's the Vortex spell of the lore. It costs 14 Winds of Magic, has a 50-second cooldown, and a 150 meter cast range. It can only be cast on the ground, and causes major magical damage in a large, randomly moving AoE for 21 seconds. It's great versus big clumps of multiple enemies, and has no problems against some reasonable armour. Obviously, since it's unpredictable, it's best to cast this in the middle of the enemy lines, rather than to target a single unit. There's no overcasting option for this spell, but to be honest, at 14 Winds of Magic it's already expensive enough. That being said, it does do a lot for the money, but as with all Vortex spells, it's unpredictable and can either get all the enemies on the map, get none of them, or completely focus your units instead, so use it at your own discretion. That concludes this guide for the Lore of Heavens. If you enjoyed this video at any point, then please do leave it a like, as it really does help out a lot. Leave a comment of anything you think I missed or should include in future videos. If you'd like to see more videos about Total War Warhammer, there are links in the card and in the description to my series. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, then maybe click that subscribe button so you stay up to date. After all, it is free. For now though, I was COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I'll see you next turn.